Good afternoon, everyone, uh, and warm welcome everyone who has signed in to a to the first of a series of webinars that will be hosted by Summer School at the University of Cape Town. As I'm sure that many of those who have joined this conversation are regulars at Summer School. We also hope that we have some of our alumni of the University of Cape Town who've joined us, and other friends and other people who are interested in the webinar series. This evening, we have the pleasure to be joined by two very prominent individuals. I'll introduce them to you very soon. To kick off this webinar series on living through COVID-19, unlocking COVID-19, current realities, future opportunities. So to kick off this first of four series, we're going to be looking at the economics of pandemics. Of course, this is something that is on everyone's mind, that although COVID presented itself as a health crisis, by its very nature and by its development very quickly into a pandemic. What we've seen at its most extreme in terms of its manifestation is the impact that it's actually having on our way of life and particularly on our economy. So we are very pleased to have this evening two, as I said, eminent personalities who I think will really help to shed light on this pandemic from a economic perspective. The two individuals who we have with us are Dr. Iraj Abedin and Professor Alan Hirsch. None of them really need extensive introduction, so I'm going to just very briefly just say something about Iraj and about Alan. So Iraj, I'm sure is well known to many of you. He's a regular commentator in the media. He writes regularly, a columnist and an opinionist as well. And I'm sure you're familiar with Iraj. One of his real assets is his ability to make things accessible to lay people, very complex economic issues, where Iraj is able to make that understandable to lay people. Iraj is chief executive of the Pan-African Capital Holdings, but we are also pleased to claim Iraj as one of our own. He, as an associate with the University of Cape Town, where he was a professor of economics, and Iraj has also served in very senior capacities as an advisor and a member of the Presidential Review Committee, and is really sought after for his views, which, as I said, are really always insightful. And Iraj is joined in this conversation by Professor Alan Hirsch. Alan Hirsch has been in government many years as an economic advisor, I think to 4 presidents, certainly 3 that I know, but maybe even 4. Alan will tell you, under Mbeki, with President Zuma, President Mandela, probably even Kgalema Motlanthe. So Alan is very familiar with economic policy from the perspective of government. And Alan also presently, in addition to his role at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town, where he was the founder, director, where he is now a professor, he is also a member of the President's Economic Advisory Council, the most recently established Economic Advisory Council. So we're really privileged to have both Alan and Iraj. So with a very brief welcome and introduction, I'm going to turn it over first to Iraj to make some comments. That will be followed by Alan. We may have some exchange of views between Alan and Iraj. And then we will open it up for the questions that we have received from many of you who have signed in for this live discussion. Some of you sent your questions ahead, and some of you will probably post questions on our question and answer feature on this live discussion. So a warm welcome. We are obviously keen to hear what the President is going to say. We've been told he will be addressing us at 8:30 this evening. I think this discussion will really help us to probably be better informed when the President does address us later this evening. So Iraj, warm welcome, and I'm going to hand over to you to kick off.
Thank you very much, Russell, and thank you to UCT for inviting me, and welcome everybody to this webinar. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to share this panel with my good friend, Professor Alan Hirsch. Economics of pandemics is a relatively new revelation for economists. We all talk about it, but quite frankly, we are learning as we go along, because it's for the first time in the registered history of economics that we have a reaction to pandemics the way we have done it in this year. I say this because, not because we haven't had pandemics before, we've had, but we've never had a situation where relatively all over the world, governments in a coordinated way and nations in a voluntary manner have agreed to shut the economy down, or a great part of it. That is new. Of course, pandemics do have a very devastating effect on the social side. That goes without saying, because it's a health matter. But when pandemics are transmitted into economic policy and public policy, and the reaction of politicians is so panic-driven right across the globe, not just in South Africa, and then they impose a huge cost to the economy. And let me just make a couple of observations. Most of you have followed the events globally to know that over the past 2 months, we have pretty much cut the global transportation aviation industry by about 90%. So about 10% of what used to operate, it's operating now, and it's operating under cargo mostly. We have shut down hospitality industry pretty much across the globe, and within nations. It's for the first time in the South, North, developed, underdeveloped, and emerging economies. Therefore, broadly, within 2 months, we have shut down something between 45 to 60% of the production side of the economy, both on the production as well as on the services sector. This is a new thing. This is not a case of economic recession. It is not a case of financial crisis that we've had almost 10 years ago, 2008, 2009. So there is no comparable basis for what you're experiencing now. Even I would say during the Second World War, which was a devastating global war, it did not reach as such a high proportion of humanity as we experience it today. The Second World War was really a war between the then European and Japan and America at the end. The rest of the globe on the production side was not affected. And even during the Second World War, governments did not shut the economies down. They converted some of the factories to making bullets and uniform and boots for the soldiers, but they didn't shut the economy down. So I emphasize this because it manifests some interesting problems in our economies to begin with. We didn't encounter COVID-19 with a global government or governance coordination, global institutions that are fit for purpose of today. We did not begin with national governments, whether in UK, United States, Italy, South Africa, Mexico, or India. None of them were fit or configured to be able to manage crises of this magnitude and be able to strike a balance between health of the nation, what is nowadays called savings life, as opposed to saving livelihood, which means keeping the economy going at the same time that we are taking care of the nation. So as a result, what we see, and I'm mindful of the time, what we see is the following. Right across the globe, governments out of panic, they've shut the economy down and they've started printing money, printing or incurring debt for the future generations. If you look at the United States, and now it used to be 3 trillion, now they're talking of another 3 trillion in less than 2 months. The UK has printed equivalent of 15% of its GDP in new cash for the first time. South Africa, as you know, $500 billion up to now, and I can assure you when the budget comes out later this evening, the minister will make statements that would say, well, I'm not sure, we have to keep the nations alive, and this is the best we can do now, but expect more changes, which means we're going to incur more and more debt, which is inevitable. So the nations, in terms of their response, governments particularly, because they weren't prepared, they are now creating debt at a rate like never before. At the same time, we are creating unemployment at a rate never before. Of course, countries like South Africa, we had already high, extremely high and structural unemployment. Now we are likely to add to that as soon as the economy opens up. Again, give you a couple of numbers. Our hospitality sector in South Africa, tourism, both domestic and international, roughly employs about 1.2 to 1.3 million people. Chances are that when the economy opens up and the lockdown completely disappears, that sector will lose something between 400,000 to 600,000 of its jobs for good and for the next while. Our aviation industry, our motorcar industry, our transportation, logistics, and so on, all of them are going to feel the pinch and the damage of the type of shutdown that has happened, not only in South Africa, but also globally. If you look at an economy like China, that has never for the past 40 years experienced what recession is, they're going to recession for the first time. Europe and globally, we're going to have recession of anything between 6 to 10 to 12%. What does that mean? It means our export for the next while, and by that I mean for the next 2 to 3 years, is going to be 40, 50, 60% below what it was. And that's the export on the mining, export on motor manufacturing, etc., etc. So all of these means the economies are going to be severely affected. And to finish my opening comments, it goes without saying, and we all know that the South African economy was a human being, it encountered COVID-19 with some serious preconditions in the form of high unemployment, high poverty, and inequalities, poor governance capacity, poor health services, poor security services. And when you have those type of preconditions, we've now learned that COVID-19 kills those who have preconditions. If the economy was a human being or a system, it's seriously vulnerable to the damages of COVID-19 because we began the process or the battle with the virus with serious socioeconomic preconditions. We'll discuss more of this as we get to discussion. Thank you very much, Russell.
Thank you, Iraj. You painted, of course, a picture that's bleak, but that is the reality. And I think the most important thing to solve or tackle any problem is to face the reality head on. But I'm sure there must be some solutions. So I hope that I think we have about between 300, 400 people who have already signed on. I hope that the message that you shared now doesn't sort of leave them with the idea that it's just sort of doom and gloom. I think we're going to come back to you later, because I'm sure that you have some suggestions as to how we get out of this. And the good news is that even those patients who have had underlying conditions when they contracted COVID, some of them also got better. And so there may be vaccines and ventilators and other, to continue the metaphor, that may be applied. So I think people should just stay online and not think that that's the full story. But you wanted to actually paint the picture of what the reality is that we're facing. Alan, I know that you have views on this, the way the pandemic is impacting in terms of our cohesion, not just globally, or rather not just as a nation, but also globally. And so it would be interesting to hear your take on pandemics and impact on the economies of the world. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Russell. It's great to be on a panel with Russell, who I met, well, got to know when he came back from studying in the UK in the 80s, and we played hockey together. And Iraj, who I overlapped with for a few years in the early 90s before he went off to the Standard Bank and I went off to work in government. So it's great. I think it's the first time we've been on a panel together. I want to share some of the conversations that I had with my students in the master's program at the Mandela School. At the Mandela School, we have a number of master's programs, and this is a module that we run with students from a range of departments on the practice of policymaking and implementation. And we, and I have to thank them for many of the interesting ideas that may come up in the course of this evening. We ended up talking quite a lot about the issue of cooperation and trust, because it turns out that in the practice of policymaking and implementation in this kind of an environment, cooperation and trust are incredibly important. It's very, very costly to be in a situation, and we'll talk more about it, where there's a lack of trust between countries, there's lack of trust within international organizations, and there may be other areas where there are trust deficits which have to be built or rebuilt. Why is it so important? Well, let's talk about this event. Why is this event such a catastrophic event? And it is a catastrophic event in terms of health, although, perhaps not as bad as the Spanish flu, but it's pretty catastrophic. And why is it such a catastrophic event economically? And the reason is because we live in a world that is very interdependent. This is a predictable surprise. This surprise is not a black swan. It's what Taleb would probably call a white swan. It's something we could predict. Perhaps we couldn't have quite predicted the impact, but we certainly could have predicted that it was going to happen. In fact, it was predicted by Bill Gates and many other people over several, the last couple of decades. But it's catastrophic because of the interdependence of the world, globalization, communications, production, travel. We've become a very interdependent world, but we also have become a world which doesn't have real insurance policies. So We've moved many parts of the world in manufacturing and other industries to just-in-time production, so our inventories are very low. We don't have lots of goods in the stores because it costs money and it takes up space to keep those kinds of goods. So things can very quickly break down because of that interdependence and because of the low level of insurance that we've taken out. We've also taken out relatively low levels of insurance in terms of international cooperation around health issues. So how have we responded internationally? So I was working for President Mbeki, and then Motlanthe, and then Zuma briefly during the global financial crisis, and I experienced the unification really of the world around that issue. We had a G20 at that point, which was just a meeting of finance ministers. The President of the United States, who, if you recall, was actually George W. Bush, not the most perhaps highly respected of all American presidents, but certainly a president who was committed to international cooperation. And with his Secretary of the Treasury, they pulled a global summit together. That global summit produced a very high level of cooperation between the 20 largest economies, which included South Africa, and or the 20 most important systemic economies, and with the rest of the world. So we had a situation where the IMF was able to respond not only to draw on the quotas that governments had committed but hadn't put into the fund, but they were also able to issue special drawing rights to the value of about $283 billion in 2009, which is a big commitment to make for an organization. The World Bank got involved, other international institutions got involved, and the G20 for 2 or 3 years was an absolutely critically important instrument of global cooperation. Now today, with the G20 hasn't really met. There've been a couple of brief meetings of G20 leaders, but G20 is currently, in case you didn't know, under the leadership, it rotates, of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very close to the United States. They clearly haven't been encouraged by the United States to pull the G20 together as tightly as it could have been pulled together. And we haven't had this kind of response. In fact, the United States has blocked the issuing of special drawing rights by the IMF, which would have enabled more funds to be issued to help governments through these difficult times. So at the global level, we're definitely worse off than we should be. We also we talked about some of the regional institutions, the European Union, for example. European Union, for which I suppose there were very high expectations, perhaps unrealistically, because health in Europe is actually a national issue, not a regional issue. The expectations on the EU are quite high. They weren't able to respond except with guidelines really in the health area. They certainly were able to establish what they called green lanes and protocols for inter-European travel. There were some funds established for European countries. So funds were basically reallocated within Europe to European countries and to developing countries. And the European Central Bank was basically took it upon itself to buy government bonds, European government bonds, which certainly helped some European countries which would have found it difficult to get buyers for their bonds, or to sell their bonds at the kind of prices they wanted to sell their bonds at. So there were some significant achievements, but perhaps not at the level that was hoped for. The African Union, well, is a much less developed institution. It's not a full economic union yet. It's not anything like the level of political coordination that the EU has. So the expectations weren't very high, but actually it has performed relatively well. The African Union, the president of the Commission and the president of the AU, that's our president Ramaphosa, and Mr. Faku, who is the president of the chair of the Commission, have led an African engagement with international organizations around financial issues in particular. President Ramaphosa has established a group of advisory group, which includes our former Finance Minister, Trevor Manuel, and a number of other distinguished Africans to engage internationally to get better financial support for Africa in these very difficult times. So that's been an achievement. Another interesting achievement has been in the Center for Disease Control. It was only set up 3 years ago in Africa, and it's been able to provide really useful advice, protocols, data, information that's helped African countries respond to the crisis. So African Union, expectations weren't high, performance reasonably good. In South Africa, we've had a pretty good run. We've got a president whose popularity rating has grown from a relatively high level in the 60s to a very high level in the high 70s, possibly even higher in recent times, because of the authority that he has been able to stamp on the situation. My experience being in the President's Economic Advisory Council has been that the presidency has been open to conversations with a wide group of economists. So we've had several seminars where people from the trade unions and people from business and people from academia and other experts have been drawn into conversations about how to respond to how to understand the crisis and how to respond to the crisis. And those conversations continue. And that's the kind of tone which the presidency has tried to set. I think it's been a little spoiled, though, obviously, by the way that some of the arms of government, the police and the army, at least initially, didn't seem to understand their role very well. The engagement with non-governmental organizations has been a little disconcerting because of the level of cooperation that's really needed across the country. And I think also some of the regulations, I think it was referred to earlier, some of the regulations which have been set have made it very difficult for people, individuals, to understand what exactly is intended and where they've come from and why they've been put forward. So it's a well-led program, but it's had certain shaky elements. Now, as we move towards the phasing out the lockdown, moving down to lower levels, it becomes more and more important to have trust between individuals, trust within communities, trust between communities and their public officials, and trust at a national level between the key players nationally. So, you know, I expect and I hope that the president will be continuing to try to build that trust when he speaks later this evening.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I'm going to come back to you, Alan, on some of those social issues that you mentioned, the issues of trust and of the social compact, I suppose, if one were to just to give, you know, a one phrase to capture it. But I just want to come to you, Iraj, quickly. You sort of started off by making the point that the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the COVID-related crisis that we're presently going through are fundamentally different. In that the one was endogenous, as in a sense that it was within the system itself, where there were certain fundamental structural problems, whereas what we're speaking about now is exogenous. It's something external to the system. It's not self-induced. So when you spoke about the extent of the crisis, because it is something that's externally induced as opposed to something internal, is the potential not greater than for a bounce back, as opposed to the 2008-2009 when there were deep-seated structural issues? Now, that's not to say that there were not structural challenges and problems as we went into this crisis, but given that it was brought by COVID itself, so the potential to get back, and then related to that, because I know that there's a lot of concern out there where there's almost a tension between what public health specialists, experts are saying, and what those who want the economy open quickly are sort of saying. And it's sort of captured in this unfortunate language that I'm going to use, because it's become so common in the sort of Trumpian language that the cure can't be worse than the problem. You know, so if you could just speak sort of a little bit about that, because I know you don't want to get into that issue of life versus livelihood, because I don't think that there is a choice. We have they both are equally important. But just the first point about the ability for us to get out of this quicker, given the fact that it was not, you know, structural necessarily, and how we have been how we've been responding to this health crisis in terms of what's probably also in the best interest of the economy, that tension.
Yeah. I think, Russell, that's a very, very central question here. In 2009 and in many other crises that we've had, they've been all financial crises. They've been crises that have affected the demand side of the economy. People have lost something, their jobs, etc., etc. And when the issue of demand or lack of credit, you can pump money into the system and the economy bounces back. This time around, we have a triple type of problem. One is the demand side, because we're just shutting things down, but we also is a supply side, because we're closing the economy willingly or intentionally. At the same time, we're affecting another dimension of economic activity, which is our what economists call it, the human spirit, the expectations, the confidence factor, and the hope. Whatever language you want to use, it all amounts to the same thing. So they are fundamentally different. And the fact that it's exogenous is, in my view, less important than the fact that it simultaneously shuts down the demand and shuts down the supply, which we've never had before in any of the crises that we've experienced before. And therefore, we got to think about it differently. We got to, I painted a picture which was very bleak, and you quite correctly pointed out that we have to face the issue. If you want to find solutions, and if you want to find ourselves out of this ditch that we found ourselves, we need to first have a very clinical understanding of what it is that we're dealing with. The COVID-19 crisis, for the reasons that Alan also highlighted, there was no lack of global coordination, and still there isn't, etc., has rolled back some of the fundamentals of the global economy. We cannot trust globalization anymore. We cannot just say, look, because China or India produces cheaper, so we must shut down our local mask manufacturers or ventilator manufacturing or alcohol or sanitation or a whole lot of stuff that we used to say, well, they are exporting to us much cheaper, we can't compete with them. Now we've realized, and it's not just South Africa, globally I'm talking, nations have recognized that price competitiveness is not sufficient reason for industrial policy. You need to have accessibility, you need to have availability, and you need to have reliability over and above price competitiveness. Now, all of that means that when we want to reboot the economy, when we want to look at restarting the economy, we got to think a completely different economic structure. We need to build new industries that up to now were globalized in a whole range of areas, in a whole lot of nations and regions. So one of the impacts of this recovery over the next while is going to be for all nations and regions to reimagine their industrial strategy. And this is not all bad news. Actually, a lot of new opportunities for manufacturing, for services and food production, and so on and so forth. So that is where we need to balance saving livelihood and saving life. because what governments have been on their panic doing is put all their resources, public and private, put their resources in savings life, which is important. But at the same time, next door, every day, we should have another team working out what are the new opportunities. We know, for example, we're going to lose 400,000 or 500,000 jobs in our hospitality, but can we now start the industries that are the industries of the future in a whole range of areas? So this tension that has been created between public health professionals and economists who want to start, it's a bit of a false dichotomy. We don't have that choice. We can't start the economy when people are dying. So let's not create false dichotomies. Let's face the issue, put two parallel processes, identify the industries that we know they're going to die or substantially die down. At the same time, identify a whole range of industries that we know there are industries that are going to come up, put them into the ground, create jobs and create revenue. Because every time that the president says we're going to spend another 100 million rand or 100 billion rand on very good national humanitarian causes, pension, food parcel, etc., tax breaks for companies to keep their employees, they are basically creating liability for future generations. That's plain and simple. At the same time, therefore, we need to create assets for the future generations. And that is what will serve the economy to come up and revive itself. So that's how I picture the situation and our challenge.
Just on that, Iraj, you're saying reimagining what a new or a changed economy may be post-COVID. How do you see renewable energy in this sort of new future? Is this not really a golden opportunity in many ways that's almost kind of forced on us? You know, the expression, don't let a good crisis go to waste.
Absolutely, Russell. I mean, not only clean energy or renewable energy, which is almost a no-brainer. Quite frankly, any minister or any government or any intellectual that argues against it is arguing against the force of gravity. But there are so many other areas. For example, we have to reimagine security. Up to now, we've been trained to define security in the form of tanks, missiles, and aeroplanes and submarines. We need to allocate resources differently. Security means different things in this age. Therefore, our resources need to be reimagined. Our government departments need to reallocate their resources differently. Private sector likewise. So that when I'm talking about reimagining, yes, energy is one part. But for example, water. In South Africa, we don't have a water strategy, and all the ministers of water that we've had over the past 10 years, they've turned out to be corrupt and unreliable and incompetent. They've stolen billions and billions. But if you ask them what is our water strategy, because you cannot take care of the health of the nation without access to water, without access and reliable and competitively priced water. So in this whole sector, there's a lot of investment to be done, a lot of jobs to be created, a lot of secondary and multiplier effect industries to be created, both on the production and on the services side. I don't want to go on and on, but I hope our audience and our colleagues take the drift of my thinking that when I talk about reimagining, our energy has to be reimagined, our water, our food, our urban design. For example, for 25 years that I know, Alan and I have been at different tables talking about RDP housing and this housing and the other housing. The reality is that we haven't dealt with those, and we have let go of the actual cities that they have degenerated, full of potholes and basic amenities don't work. Now we got to reinvest in that. And when we reinvest, look how many industries from cement to brick to daily maintenance, if we do it, not talk about it, not allocate and steal the money, but if we do it, jobs will be created, industries will be established. So reimagining is not just about clean energy, but also clean and harvesting water, recycling water, etc., and allocating water between human settlements and economic activity. All these are part of reimagining and restructuring our economy. And COVID-19, in my view, has created exactly the right proportion crisis that we mustn't let it go so easily.
Thank you, Iraj. Alan, let me just sort of turn to you for a moment, because you spoke quite a lot about the need for trust, for, to some extent, a new social compact. Now, what is unfortunate part of our history as South Africa is in crises we default to a law and order solution. We see it in strikes. We've seen it in many other areas, and there seems to be tendencies of that default to sort of a law and order, and not necessarily in the best sense. Sometimes quite draconian, quite authoritarian. And we've seen aspects of that in this COVID crisis, where police, army seem to be, in some instances, sort of running the show, and that does undermine a lot of the trust, and also erode the support that you mentioned that there is for the way in which the presidency is trying to lead us through this sort of crisis. Maybe you can share a little bit of your insights into why that has sort of been the case, and how do we try to challenge that, to roll that back, and see this as an opportunity to have a, not only to look at the economy differently, but also how we deal with crises and have a more humanitarian response, as opposed to this law and order response.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to speculate about exactly why some of those things have happened. Clearly, I think in the law and order sphere, it's a kind of our past coming back to haunt us. We have a history of authoritarian institutions, which we began to reverse, I think, in the first decade and a half of our democracy. But then, ominous signs happened when, under President Zuma, military titles came back into the police force, and the police started to be used for purposes that they really weren't intended to be in a democracy. So there've been progress, and there've been setbacks, and there can be progress again. In the in the whole area of trust, if you think back to when Zola Skweyiya was the Minister of Social Development, the relationship that he built up with non-governmental organizations, with NGOs, the relation built up in the Mbeki era between the health department and NGOs, also in parts of the Zuma era, have been fantastic, and that interaction has been terrific, and those seem to go backwards and forwards. But rather than speculate on that, let's look at the opportunities for moving out of this. So the first thing is, I think that in order to move towards a phasing down of the lockdown, in other words, to identify those areas where it's safe and where it's absolutely essential that people start getting back to work, it can't be done by government alone. It can't be done by a set of detailed regulations developed by government for the mines, for the transport sector, for different parts of manufacturing, etc., etc. It has to be done in a cooperative process, and it has to be done in a process where the unions, and we've seen around the schools question how the teachers' unions have said, we're not certain that the situation is safe, we don't want to go back. We've seen in other sectors where the unions have said, we want to be, I think it was in the mines even, they said we want to be certain that the correct conditions are in place. Now, this is an ideal opportunity to rebuild a trust relationship, for government to facilitate a conversation between employers and employees in the key sectors that we have to move back into production about the protocols what kind of protocols, the details of those protocols, how to implement them, who's responsible for what, and so on. So I think at a sectoral and subsectoral level, there are terrific opportunities for social compacting, or even, not to be so fancy about it, just for people to get together from different sides of the table and work out the way forward together. I think in the longer term, it's probably necessary to try to do that at a broader national level. As Iraj has correctly pointed out, most of the countries of the world are digging quite a big, deep hole in the debt that they are incurring. We're spending money that we don't have. We were already spending money that we didn't have before the crisis, and now we're spending more money that we don't have, and that we are getting through the issuing of government bonds and through a range of other instruments. Now, to get back from there, we're going to probably have to have very high-level deals between government, business, and labor around prices, around wages, around taxes. I think there is scope, if we have the imagination and if we have the leadership that, I know we do have, but it doesn't always come forward. There is a possibility, I think, for using this crisis to rebuild social engagement of the key social partners at a national level around how do we dig ourselves out of this hole, and how do we move forward to that new economy that Iraj has so aptly described.
Thanks, Alan. Iraj, I want to sort of go back to something that has come up quite a bit, and that's about the dangers and also sometimes the necessities in terms of spending one's way out of a crisis, right? Or what in the USA they called quantitative, economics. And I think it was Paul Krugman, who was actually making the case in the US that that this idea that deficits are necessarily detrimental or negative. I mean, his arguments are that as long as your GDP is growing at a high enough rate, your deficits just almost automatically melt away. Now, I mean, that may be the case in an economy like the USA. Just maybe share with us what are some of the dangers that we face here in that sort of situation, because we're going to have to spend some money and throw some money at these problems as we emerge out of this crisis.
Yeah, I think the quantitative easing is really a possibility for currencies that act and they have the stature globally to be some kind of reserve currency. The most prominent one, obviously, is the United States dollar, followed by euro and a bit of pound and a bit of yen. Other than that, other countries have very limited, if any, capacity to do quantitative easing without getting into trouble. So if governments spend, it's like people, families, individuals incurring debt. Debt is not a bad thing if you use it for productive and capacity building. As a student, most of us take loans. And why do the banks lend us? Because they know that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, we're going to graduate, we're going to have a job, we're going to have an income, we're going to pay it back. So debt is not a bad thing at all, provided debt is used to build production capacity. But as I was saying earlier on, at the moment, governments are incurring debt, whether they are printing money or they're issuing bonds and borrowing from other people. The reality is that they're incurring debt, which means they are creating liability for future generations. We have to do it. We've got to do it. Of course, our assumption is that it will be done cleanly and productively. But at the same time, we got to build the income generating capacity, the production capacity, the tax base so that in 10 years' time, when these government bonds come due, they can be serviced. And that is my concern. My concern is that we are not paying enough attention to that. And if we don't, well, a number of things will happen. First of all, governments will become less and less able. They will degenerate to incapable states or failed states, and then nations will become denuded of their high skilled resources or highly competent individuals who will look around and say, well, I really don't want to live in this society. Let me seek other opportunities elsewhere. So you begin to create a systemic, internal systemic pushing away capacity, and the more capacity you lose, the more capable you are of paying back the debt that you've created. You end up as a highly indebted nation, which we have a few of them around of the globe. Argentina is a good example. When 60 years ago was one of the top performing per capita economies in the world. And today they remain a highly indebted and stuck in low growth type of high debt, low growth. On the continent, we have examples. In Asia, we have examples. So it's a very predictable scenario. So I agree with Paul Kruger that debt and deficit, we shouldn't worry about it outside the context of what happens to the economy. I would be very critical of a corporate that is high generating income and has got no debt on its balance sheet because it's not running the business efficiently. Efficiency requires that your income generation capacity and your debt servicing capacity are in some kind of sync. If either of them is out of sync, you are inefficient. And nations that borrow without paying attention to creating debt service capacity, they will become inefficient and ultimately fail the states.
I mean, that's a nice sort of segue, Iraj, into, is this an opportunity for us to really take bold decisions in relation to our state-owned enterprises?
Absolutely. I mean, we couldn't, as I said, we mustn't waste, I think you said it, we mustn't waste this fantastic and an unfortunate crisis. Our state enterprises need to be redefined. Some of them should be closed down without second thought. Some of them should be redefined and expanded. For example, if we want to rebuild our cities, we need development finance institutions that are capable of financing large and long dated, meaning 20, 30, 40-year infrastructure projects. Here, the like of Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA, would be a good institution to rebuild and refocus its institutions. If you want to restructure our economy, to concentrate the highly concentrated industries, you need an institution like the IDC to be recapacitated. It has lost a lot of its capacity. It needs to be recapacitated, and its mission or business mandate need to be redefined. If we want to grow our agriculture and agri-processing, we need a land bank that is not bankrupt. It's a land bank that is capable and able, both from a balance sheet point of view as well as from a capability, human skills point of view, to give support, short, medium, long-term support for building our agriculture and agro-processing. And I can go on and on and on. But then we have over 700 state-owned enterprises. Well, they got to be shut down. Some of them are just become a platform for siphoning money out, and they do nothing other than wasting money. So we need to really rethink our public sector, because no country can rise to the challenges that we face without a capable state. We know we've put this term for 30 years on every policy that I have ever read, government policy, and yet nobody does anything. Presidents come, presidents go, the state goes further down, not up. So state-owned enterprises on their own, without a capable state, are not going to do the job, Russell. The two are intrinsically and systemically linked, and we need to think about a capable public sector that is set to serve the nation, not to serve political missions or siphon money out.
Alan, that's a nice lead onto you. What is the Presidential's Economic Advisory Council's role during this sort of period, and what kind of sort of game plan has been sort of thought through? I mean, if you can maybe boil it down to maybe 3-5 key sort of things that you are advising need to be in place as we start emerging from COVID-19 and try to get the economy back to working again.
It's been a really interesting experience. When I was appointed, along with I think 17 other people, to the council in October last year, I didn't think it was. I thought it was going to be really fun. We'd meet the president. We'd write a few papers. We've been really busy. So we've been working on a number of areas. But if you want to talk about the three that I think are the most critical that we've been working on is, firstly, finance. How to finance the cost of the health crisis, and how to finance the rebuilding of the economy. So those areas of public finance in particular, and it's very much the fiscus rather than the monetary authorities that are going to have to play the biggest role. There's been really good work on and really good conversations about. The last seminar we had was a seminar about macroeconomics, which included one of the questions that you asked, Russell, about quantitative easing, for example. And we have I think most of the people on the panel had a similar point of view to Iraj's in the discussion. The second area is the area of the phase down. So a lot of the conversation that's been happening in the President's Economic Advisory Council has been how to organize the phase down. So one of UCT's top economists, Haroon Borat, has developed, for example, a way to analyze which workers are the most important and which workers are most easily able to go back to work. He's done, he's tried to classify the labor force into different parts of the labor force in relation to the phasing down of a lockdown situation. So that's the second area. And the third area is the area that Iraj has been talking about. It's what happens afterwards. Where should we be focusing on how to rebuild the economy so that we're able to grow again and grow sufficiently to be able to reduce levels of poverty and unemployment, and also to pay back our debt. So there's a lot of focus there on innovation, new industries, reorganizing the network industries, transport, water, energy. The regulatory environment in those sectors has to change quite considerably, as well as the investment environment, and sectoral strategies that might support the sunrise industries going forward. And there's some industries which are weak at the moment, which may recover somewhat, and we'll have to focus on them too. The whole issue of the informal sector is absolutely critical, and we've spent a lot of time trying to think, how do you provide relief in the informal sector, and trying to engage with government about those issues as well. But I think those three areas are the big three: finance, the phase down, and how to rebuild.
Thanks. We sort of drawing to a close, and I just want to sort of reassure those who are on this discussion that the questions that we've been receiving, I've been grouping them under themes and paraphrasing them and putting them to the panelists, to Alan and to Iraj, and I hope that that I've done justice to the questions that you raised. If not, I sincerely apologize, but I tried to reflect as best I could the kinds of concerns that were coming up and the questions that were coming up. So in sort of conclusion, I'm going to put it to both Alan and to Iraj and ask them to perhaps look into the sort of future, if that's sort of possible, because of course everyone is anxious to sort of know when are we coming out of this, how long will this go on for, how long will it take for the economy to start growing again. Of course, it's not an exact science, but I think that with the experience that you both have and your involvement in these issues, so a bit of sort of crystal ball gazing. And then I also really want to thank African Bank, who sponsoring this this live discussion, and we're really appreciative of African Bank for realizing the importance of these kinds of engagements and stepping forward. So we want to acknowledge them. But if you want to do a little bit of sort of crystal ball gazing, Iraj, we'll sort of start with you, and then Alan, because I think people really want to have some sort of sense that there is a light at the end of this tunnel.
Yeah, thank you very much once again, and thank for everybody to be on here on this webinar. In terms of predicting how quickly and how we will get out, there is nothing automatic. Is it a disaster? Not really. We've got an opportunity to reimagine, restructure our economy. I am quietly optimistic that this crisis has paved the way for us to rebuild and rejuvenate our manufacturing sector and pay attention to some of our structural, logistical, meaning water, energy, urban infrastructure, human and health issues. So if we pay attention to that, this year obviously we'll have a contraction, without a doubt, close to 10% of the GDP. But from next year, if it's a big if we begin to implement what needs to be done now, we will have actually from next year onwards relatively robust growth, because our economy was in a dip. We went deeper and deeper into the ditch, and we can come up from a very low base relatively consistently, provided we do the planning as I've been suggesting, and Alan I think confirmed that they're applying their mind to it. Then we will have a different economy, and the crisis would have been used to deal with some of our structural issues.
Thanks, Iraj. That's really reassuring. Alan?
Yeah, that conforms to some of the modelling that I've seen as well. So I think Iraj is right, and I'm pretty, and I hope he is. We could grow a little faster next year than we have in the many years back. I think what we need to do is, as he said, and I think as we have to emphasize, is build on what we've achieved here. I think that the level that people have learned to live in a different way, they've learned to work in a different way, they've learned to depend on each other in different ways, they've learned new values, they've learned new ways of thinking about what's important. And I do think that the opportunities for building a cooperative society where there's greater trust in the future has put us, in a position where if we are able to take advantage of that, we could really move out of the terrible slump that we've been in, not in the last 2 or 3 years, but in fact, since effectively 2010, we've had a deteriorating economic performance. And I think this is an opportunity for us to get out of that. And I'm hopeful and positive about the way we can move forward.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you, Iraj, and everyone else who tuned in. I hope you found this interesting. I hope that you learned some new insights, a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation, some hope, some optimism, and just to thank the team behind the scenes, who provide all the sort of technological infrastructure, background, our information, communication technology people at the University of Cape Town. They do a great job, able to accommodate all of you on the platform. And thank our summer school colleagues for putting on this exciting webinar series. There'll be a few more. We'll be looking at issues on leadership in crisis, on governance, on ethics. We're also going to look at the pandemic from the perspective of health. Some of the interventions, responses in terms of development of vaccines and some of those issues as well. So there's a lot to look forward to. We'll give you, you'll get advance notice. Please look out for these. There'll be at intervals of 2 weeks, and we really look forward to having you back as we continue our discussions around COVID-19. Thank you very much, and go well and keep safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.